So to understand what the Buddha is then, imagine yourself, think of yourself at a time when you are most peaceful, when your mind is very clear, when you feel a sense of presence, when you feel that you understand what's going on, and you're not confused, don't have full of desires, you're not angry at any of these things. Now what does that feel like? It feels good, right? You feel sane, you feel clear, you feel you understand what's going on. And that is what the Buddha is, just much more so. So that is one way of understanding the Buddha, with this beautiful clarity of mind that we all touch occasionally. We move in that direction sometimes. And that is how you can understand the Buddha. Clarity and sanity. Now if you look at it in that way, somebody who is awakened, clear and sane, it starts to make sense what enlightenment actually is all about. Of course, it is much more than that. It's also about the ending of suffering, the ending of defilements. It's about happiness and compassion, all these kind of things. But sometimes it's good to just explain it in very simple terms, so it doesn't feel so far away from us. We can actually relate to what the Buddha was all about. So that is just a small suggestion for you. Try that and see if that kind of reflection works. And if it does, I think you can maybe gain some more sense of connection to the Buddha. And there's another thing as well, which I think is something which makes it hard sometimes to relate to the Buddha. And that is the fact that certainly when I started off reading about Buddhism and reading about the Buddha, it always occurred to me that the way the Buddha was explained by many kind of manuals and commentaries on the Buddha, he always was explained as this kind of almost like godlike creature with all kind of supernormal powers, and somebody who existed for maybe time immemorial, and he was like kind of sometimes even described as a kind of energy behind everything else in the universe, and something which is always there but sometimes get reincarnated just for the benefit of humanity or whatever. And all these things I found it very, very hard to relate to. How could I, as a human being, relate to something that was completely out of this world, quite literally, something completely different, a god, something which had nothing to do with me? I couldn't relate to that. I couldn't. How could he understand me if I'm a human being? But he is something completely different. How can I, when I read his life, gain any inspiration from that life if he is like a god or he is something completely different? It didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't actually relate to that thing. And of course, it was only when I started reading what the Buddha actually said about himself and the kind of stories that you find in the suttas about the Buddha, that I started to realize that all of these other stories, they tend to be exaggerations. They're like legends and myths which grew up after the Buddha passed away. Because this is what happens in the world. When somebody who is important to you, when they pass away, like the Buddha or somebody else who's a spiritual teacher, it's one of these things in the human mind. We want to build them up. We feel a loss inside of us. And because we have a loss that our teacher has disappeared, we want to build them up and make them into something which maybe they are not. And then the legends and the myths and the exaggerations start to happen. And this also happens in Buddhism.